The day my father's will was read, my stepmother looked at me like I was furniture she'd forgotten to throw out. I was standing in the hallway of the family law office on Bay Street, marble floors, the kind that echo every footstep, wearing the same blazer I'd worn to every important meeting for the past 3 years, the same one I'd worn when I signed the papers that nobody in that room knew about. My stepmother, Lorraine, had her hand on my half-brother's arm like she needed to hold herself upright. Maybe she did. Maybe somewhere underneath all that composure, she already knew. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My father, Robert Calloway, built Calloway Financial Group from a 2-room office in Mississauga into one of the most respected mid-size wealth management firms in Ontario. He was the kind of man who wore the same watch for 30 years, drove a sensible car, and remembered the name of every single person who ever worked for him. He was also the kind of man who, somewhere around my 14th birthday, stopped being able to hold 2 things at once, his career and his family. Not because he stopped loving us, but because Lorraine made it very clear there wasn't room for both. I was 12 when she came into our lives, 13 when she married him, 14 when I started eating dinner alone in my room because the table felt like enemy territory. By 15, I had learned to read silence, the specific silence of a room when someone has just said something about you before you walked in. My mother had passed when I was 9. Breast cancer, caught late. My father grieved the way some men do, by filling the space as quickly as possible so he wouldn't have to sit with it. I don't blame him for that anymore. I used to. For a long time, I used to blame him for almost everything. Lorraine had a son from her first marriage, Brendan. He was 2 years older than me, broad-shouldered, easy laughing, the kind of person who moves through the world like it was built to accommodate him. He wasn't cruel exactly, he was something worse, indifferent. To him, I was just a complication in the house, an inconvenient presence in his mother's otherwise tidy new life. The 3 of them had a rhythm that I was never part of. Inside jokes I didn't understand, weekend trips I wasn't invited on, a shorthand built over dinners I wasn't present for. My father would look at me sometimes across the kitchen with something in his eyes I couldn't quite name back then. I know now what it was. It was guilt that had nowhere to go. I left for university the September I turned 17, a year early on an academic scholarship to the University of Waterloo for mathematics and finance. When I told my father, Lorraine was the one who spoke first. "That's quite far," she said, not looking up from her phone. It was 45 minutes away. My father drove me to campus himself. He helped me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs, and when we were done, he stood in my tiny residence room and looked at the narrow bed and the single window, and he said, "You're going to be fine, Avery." His voice cracked on the last word. I pretended not to notice. So did he. That was the last real moment we had for a long time. University was where I learned who I actually was without an audience watching to see if I'd fail. I was good at things. Quietly, consistently, stubbornly good. I graduated with distinction, went directly into a master's program in financial economics at Queen's, then landed a position at a boutique investment firm in downtown Toronto. I was 23. I worked 14-hour days and didn't complain about it because I genuinely loved the work. The numbers made sense to me in a way people rarely did. My father and I spoke on the phone every few weeks. Surface-level things. Weather, work, how's the commute? Once a year I'd go home for Christmas, sit at the table that never quite felt like mine, and watch Lorraine refill Brendan's wine glass before my father's. Small things. The kind of things you file away without meaning to. What I didn't tell my father was that I'd started quietly buying shares in Calloway Financial Group. Not all at once. Not in any way that would appear on anyone's radar. I'd been watching the firm for years. The patterns, the trajectory, the points where the capital structure showed its age. I understood it the way you understand a place you grew up in, better than the people who thought they owned it. Over 4 years, through numbered companies and careful structuring, I acquired a position. I am not going to pretend there wasn't a part of me that wanted leverage, that wanted, someday, to be in a room where someone looked at me and finally had to take me seriously. But mostly, honestly, Mostly, I did it because it was a good investment, and because some part of me still felt connected to something my father had built, even when I didn't feel connected to him. The call came on a Wednesday in November. My father's assistant, a kind woman named Paula who had worked with him for 20 years, left me a voicemail. He had collapsed at his desk. A stroke. He was at St. Michael's Hospital. She said he was stable but that I should come. I was in a meeting when I saw the notification. I stepped out, listened to the message in the stairwell, and then sat down on the cold concrete steps for about 90 seconds before I stood back up and drove to Toronto. He looked smaller in the hospital bed. That's the thing nobody tells you. The people you have complicated feelings about become just people the moment you see them in a hospital gown. All the old armor between us felt suddenly ridiculous. I sat beside him for 3 hours that first night, and we talked more honestly than we had in 15 years. He told me he knew he'd failed me, not in the vague, avoidant way people sometimes confess things so they can feel absolved, but specifically, clearly, with the kind of directness that I think had always been somewhere in him, just buried. I let her tell me what was important, he said. And I knew the whole time that it was wrong, and I kept telling myself I'd fix it. I didn't fix it. I didn't say it was okay. It wasn't, and he didn't need me to lie to him. I held his hand and I said, I'm here now. He recovered enough to go home, but he was different after. Slower. The left side of his face had a subtle droop that never fully resolved. He tired easily. And something in the dynamic at the house had shifted. Lorraine seemed to understand, in the way that calculating people always understand, power before anyone else does, that the situation had changed. She began moving things. I found out through Paula, who called me in February, 6 months after the stroke, her voice carefully neutral in the way that means someone is trying not to say the thing they're actually calling to say. Your father has been talking to estate lawyers, she said. Lorraine has been attending those meetings. I thanked her. I sat with that information for a long time. My father died in April, peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday night. I was in Ottawa for a client presentation. I got the call at 6 a.m. from Brendan, of all people, who delivered the news in 12 words and then said he'd be in touch about arrangements. I drove back to Toronto in silence, no music. Just the highway and the early light and the specific emptiness of knowing you'd run out of time to have a few more conversations. The memorial was held at the firm's offices. His choice, apparently, stipulated in a letter he'd left with his lawyer. He wanted to be remembered where he'd done his life's work. 60 or 70 people gathered in the main meeting room, which had been rearranged with rows of chairs and a photograph of him on a display screen. His staff, his colleagues. People who had genuinely loved working for him. I arrived in a charcoal blazer and stood in the lobby. I had not been told what time to arrive. I had not been consulted about the program or the flowers or the catering. I had received a brief email from Brendan with the date and address, as though I were a business contact. Lorraine was near the entrance. When she saw me, she didn't say hello. She looked at me with a smile that did not reach anywhere near her eyes and said, in a voice just low enough that only I could hear, "This isn't really a day for complications." I looked at her. I'm his daughter. And this is a private event, she said, for family and close friends. I think you know that the last few years have made things complicated. I was aware of people nearby, not watching exactly but present. I could feel the particular stillness of a room holding its breath. I was about to respond when I heard footsteps behind me. A man I recognized. Thomas Weatherly, my father's longest tenured partner, a man who had been with the firm for over 25 years, came through the glass doors and stopped when he saw the two of us. He looked at Lorraine. He looked at me. And then, something shifted in his face. Avery. He said my name quietly, like a statement rather than a greeting. I nodded. He glanced down briefly, just briefly, at something on his phone. Then he looked back up at me, and I understood, from the way his expression had settled into something careful and deliberate, that he knew, not everything, but enough. He turned toward the room, where people had begun to notice the pause at the entrance, and he said, in the measured voice of someone who has been in boardrooms for 3 decades, Would everyone please take a moment? I'd like to acknowledge the arrival of one of the firm's principal shareholders. The room tilted. Lorraine went very still beside me. Thomas looked at her, then back at the room. Avery Calloway holds a controlling interest in Calloway Financial Group. That was confirmed this morning by the firm's legal and compliance team. He paused. She was also, of course, Robert's daughter, and she belongs here. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard. Brendan was standing near the front of the room. I watched the color leave his face the way water leaves a glass, completely and all at once. His mother reached out and gripped the back of a chair. I didn't smile. I didn't want to. This wasn't triumph. Or not only that, it was grief and anger and exhaustion and love and about 15 years of swallowed words, all compressed into one moment in a room that smelled like my father's office. I walked in. I sat in the front row. I stayed for the entire memorial and said nothing publicly because it wasn't the moment for it. But afterward, when most people had gone, Thomas sat beside me and told me what he knew. My father had changed his will twice in the last 2 years of his life. The final version, the one Lorraine had apparently believed would stand, had been drawn up during a period when his cognitive recovery was being assessed. Lorraine had been present for those appointments. She had, according to at least 2 witnesses, suggested certain provisions. But there was an earlier document, one drawn up in the weeks right after his stroke, before the situation at home had fully shifted, during a window when my father was frightened and clear-eyed in the specific way people sometimes become when they understand their own mortality. That document had been filed with a separate lawyer, one Lorraine didn't know about, and it named me as the primary beneficiary of his personal estate. Everything connected to the firm she had never been entitled to. That had always been governed by the shareholder agreements, and she had never understood them well enough to know what she was trying to move around. Paula, it turned out, had known about the second lawyer. My father had asked her to hold on to a number, just a phone number, and told her, "If anything happens to me and things go sideways, you give that to Avery." She had. The previous November, 2 days after the stroke, I had made a phone call I hadn't told anyone about. In the weeks that followed, the estate was settled according to the earlier will. Lorraine's lawyer contested it, of course. That process was not brief or pleasant, but the earlier document was valid. The witnesses were credible, and my father's own voice, he had made a short audio recording, which the separate lawyer had kept, was heard in a closed session that I was present for and that I will not describe in detail here, except to say that I sat in that room and listened to my father speak, and it was the last gift he gave me. Lorraine and Brendan vacated the house in Oakville by June. I did not take any satisfaction in that particular part. I want to be honest about that. I had wanted for so many years some version of a reckoning, some moment where the scales corrected themselves. But when it actually happened, it mostly just felt quiet, empty in a way I hadn't expected. What I kept was the firm, not to prove anything, not anymore. I took a seat on the board, brought in a management team I trusted, and made sure that the people who had worked loyally for my father for years were taken care of. Paula retired with a proper pension. 2 senior advisors who had been quietly overlooked for promotions under the previous board structure were elevated. The firm's name didn't change. I kept that too. Calloway. It was always mine. There are people who hear this story and want it to be a clean revenge arc. The villain punished, the hero vindicated, credits roll. It's tidier that way. More satisfying. But the truth is that the person I most needed something from was my father, and I got it. In a hospital room in November, with the city lights coming through the window and his hand in mine, I got it. Everything that came after was just paperwork. Though, I will say this, on the morning after the memorial, I sat in my father's office, my office now, and I turned his chair toward the window. The view was of the financial district, all glass and gray sky, the kind of view that looks like ambition. I thought about the 12-year-old who used to eat dinner alone in her room. I thought about the drive to Waterloo, and the cracked voice in that tiny residence room, and the phone calls about nothing, and the Christmas tables that never felt like mine. I thought about how long I'd waited for someone to say, out loud, in a room full of people, "She belongs here." And I thought, I know. I always knew. I just needed to be patient enough to let everyone else catch up. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes for the truth to surface. Not in a dramatic way, not lightning bolt, not courtroom revelation, but in the slow, grinding, unglamorous way that things actually tend to work out in real life. What I keep coming back to is this: none of what happened was luck. It was the accumulated weight of 1,000 quiet decisions made over years in private, when no one was watching and no one would have blamed me for giving up. When my stepmother looked at me in that lobby and told me I didn't belong there, she was operating on the assumption that she had won, and for a long time, by most visible measures, she had. She had the house. She had the house. She had my father's attention. She had the table I was quietly removed from. What she didn't have, what she had never bothered to understand, was the foundation my father actually built, and what it was worth, and who had been paying close enough attention to know. That's the thing about integrity. It doesn't announce itself. I didn't buy those shares to set a trap. I bought them because I loved the work, because I understood the firm better than most people in it, and because some part of me still felt connected to something my father made even when I didn't feel connected to him. The return on that investment wasn't just financial. It was the result of acting rightly, consistently over a long period of time, even when acting rightly got me nothing visible. Even when it looked from the outside like I was simply absent, and the intelligence required. I don't mean cleverness, I mean genuine understanding. That came from the same place. From sitting with difficult things instead of flinching away from them. From learning to read a balance sheet and a room with equal care. My father was a man who built something real, and I understood it because I had studied it the way you study something you love, not something you want to exploit. Lorraine never understood the difference. She saw the firm as an asset to be managed. I saw it as a living thing that needed to be protected. What surprised me most afterward wasn't the legal outcome. It was the quietness of it. I had imagined for years that vindication would feel like something enormous. Instead, it felt like the end of a long commute. You arrive, and you're relieved, and then you're just there. The work begins. My father asked Paula to hold on to a phone number. That was the whole thing. One phone number, held by a woman who had worked loyally for 20 years, passed to me at the right moment. That's how the truth got through. Not through force or strategy, but through the perseverance of people who kept showing up, kept doing the right thing. Kept trusting that it mattered even when the outcome wasn't guaranteed. I think about the 12-year-old eating dinner alone in her room sometimes. I want to tell her that the silence is not the end of the story. That building something real, even slowly, even privately, even when nobody is acknowledging it, is never wasted. The choices you make when no one is watching are exactly the ones that end up mattering most. The chair is still turned toward the window. The view hasn't changed, but I'm finally in the right seat to see it.